Exodus chapter number 19, we see God meet with Moses and tell him that his desire is to make Israel a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, and that if they would be willing to obey his words and keep his covenant, that he would prosper them and bless them. Moses then relays the message to the people of Israel, and when they hear the words of the Lord, they tell Moses that they would be willing to keep this covenant and they would obey the voice of the Lord. So on the third day following Moses' meeting with God, it says that a thick cloud descended on Mount Sinai and the entire mountain was engulfed with smoke and fire. And it's here that Moses then ascends the mountain and he meets with God himself. And while Moses is here on Mount Sinai meeting with the Lord, they're interacting with one another. God gives Moses his commands and the law that he would relay to the Israelites. And the law that he gives to Moses we call the 10 Commandments, which is also called the Decalogue. Decalogue meaning 10 words. And the 10 Commandments can be broken down into two separate parts. The first 4 commandments are concerned with how the Israelites can love and honor God, while the latter 6 are concerned with how the Israelites can love and honor one another. The first command in the Decalogue is that Israel is to have no other gods, that He is one, that there is only one true God, that Yahweh is the God who brought them out of Egypt and there is no other. And Israel is to have no other gods in His place. There is none like Him. He is holy. He is set apart. He is distinct from everything in heaven and everything on the earth. That God is God alone and Israel is to serve no one else. The next command is that Israel is not to make any image of God. That because God is holy, because there's nothing in the heavens or nothing on earth that is like God, because He is separate and distinct from everything that is common to man, you could not ascribe an image to God. Because of His holiness, it would taint or devalue Him, and it would try to make Him something that He's not. That you cannot ascribe an image to God because there is nothing and there is no one like God. Again, to reiterate God's holiness, they're commanded not to take the Lord's name in vain or to misuse His name. That by misusing the name of Yahweh, by taking His name in vain, it's robbing it of the value that it has. God is holy. He is unlike everything and everyone and all of creation. He is separate and distinct from it, and to misuse His name or to devalue it in any way or to use it in a careless manner would be to rob God of His glory, and that's why He says no one will go unpunished who misuses the name of the Lord. And finally, the 4th command concerning the worship of God, He commands us to remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. That just as He rested on the 7th day of creation and He set apart the 7th day to be a holy day, that He is saying that that's what we need to do as well. That 6 days we will labor, and on the 7th day we will set that 7th day apart as holy. That just as God is wanting to set Israel apart to be this kingdom of priests and a holy nation to serve Him and worship Him, that this is going to be evident to the world by what they're doing with their work week. That just as everyone else in the world around them, the rest of the world will be working all 7 days. Israel will rest on the Sabbath day to be a testimony to the world that they have set this day apart to the one true God, and that they are honoring the one true God by giving this day to be a holy day of rest consecrated unto the Lord. Now that is the commandments concerning how Israel would worship and honor God, and the rest is going to be how Israel would honor and love one another. And we see that evident in the next command. The 5th command is to honor your father and mother so that your days might be long upon the earth. It's the only commandment with a promise that you were to honor your parents and the Lord would bless you because of this. And the reason God is going to bless you is because it's said in different places throughout Scripture that there's no authority given under heaven except that God has allowed. That if your parents are your parents, it's because God allowed them to be your parents. So if these people have been given the authority over your life by the hand of God, by you dishonoring them, not only are you dishonoring your earthly parents, your earthly father, you're dishonoring your heavenly Father. That you are rebelling against Him because He is the one who has allowed them to be your parents in the first place. Now, this doesn't mean that you won't always see eye to eye with them, that there won't be disagreements, or that even at times your parents could be cruel and harsh and mistreat you. That is something that is commonplace, and that's because we live in a world filled with people that are sinful and wayward from God. But what he's saying is that we need to honor them, meaning that we reverence the authority that God has given them. God has allowed them to be our parents, so we are going to honor that authority, honor the position, and give them the respect that they deserve. The next command that we see is that the Israelites were commanded not to kill. And that doesn't mean that there was a complete prohibition on killing. If that was the case, then Israel would not be allowed to eat meat, or they would not be allowed to engage in any kind of battle. They would have to be completely pacifist. But that's not what this scripture is saying. When it says kill, it means that they are not permitted to murder. They are not permitted to unjustly take the life of someone else. That this person is created in the image of God, and unless that person does something to sin against God, or they do something to sin against their brother, it is not just for you to take their life. So when it says thou shalt not kill, it means that Israel was not permitted to unlawfully or unjustly take another person's life. The next command is that Israel is not permitted to commit adultery. That just as they are in a covenant relationship with God and they have vowed to be faithful to Him alone and that there would be no other God in their life, they made a covenant relationship to their spouse. That they made a promise to the one that they bonded themselves with, that whenever they came together in this covenant relationship of marriage, they vowed to be one flesh, that there would be no one else brought into this, and that if they were to go out and seek someone else, if they were to break this covenant, that they would no longer be faithful to that person. And this relationship was supposed to mirror Israel's relationship to God. That they vowed to be in a covenant relationship with Him. They vowed to be faithful to God alone. And this was supposed to be mirrored by their marriage. That their marriage would be faithful to one spouse, and that they would be in covenant with them alone, and they vowed not to break that. And if you were to go outside of the marriage to seek another relationship, to seek someone else other than the one that you have bound yourself to through this one flesh union, you would be committing adultery. The next command we see is that Israel is told that they are not permitted to steal. That stealing is forbidden. That if God blesses your brother with something, it is not your place to take that from your brother. That it is unlawful, it's unjust, and it's evil for you to take something that belongs to someone else. The next command is that they were not permitted to bear false witness, that they were not permitted to go out and either slander people or spread a false report, to spread untruths, to tell people things that were fallacious or things that would cause divisions or controversies. That they were to be a people bound by the truth, that they were supposed to be people that were speaking truthfully, that they are representatives of God Himself, that Israel is supposed to be this holy nation, and for them to go around and spread false reports, that's not only bringing reproach upon them, that's not only defaming their own name, that is bringing shame upon the name of the Lord. That when Israel brings reproach on themselves, that brings reproach on the name of the Lord. And they were not permitted to speak falsely, because whenever they began to speak falsely, that would then fall back on God Himself. And finally, the last command we see is that they were not permitted to covet. That to covet means that you yearn or you desire something that does not belong to you. That you are not allowed to have this evil desire for your brother's possessions, whether it be your brother's spouse, whether it be your brother's belongings, whether it be your brother's position, whatever it might be. You were not allowed to have this yearning, this desire for it, because when you allow desire to take root in your heart, it always leads to you breaking another command of God. If you earnestly desire your brother's wife, it's going to lead to adultery. If you have this bitterness, this hatred towards your brother, it's going to lead to murder. If you have this desire for your brother's possessions, it's going to lead to stealing. So coveting is this sin. It's this law that if you end up breaking it, it will end up leading you to breaking the other commands of God. So these are the 10 commandments, and it says that after God spoke these words to Moses, that God Himself took 2 stone tablets and He wrote these commands down on these tablets with His very own finger. That these commands were written by the very finger of God and they were given to Moses. However, whenever you keep reading the book of Exodus as well as the rest of the Torah, whenever you start looking at what transpires after this, is that God doesn't stop at 10 commands. That very quickly God gives well over 10 commands, and eventually we end up with 613 laws given to Moses by God that the Israelites were supposed to abide by. Now, you might be wondering, why are there so many different laws? And when you look at the individual laws that God gives to Moses, they all serve different purposes. Some of them govern how Israel would interact with each other and interact with other foreign nations. And even it was concerned with how Israel would interact with God and worship Him. And you can divide these laws into 3 categories. You had civil laws, which was concerned with how Israel would interact with one another, how they would treat one another, and the punishment if somebody were to mistreat or abuse a fellow Israelite. You had ceremonial laws, which was concerned with how Israel would worship God and what they needed to do to separate themselves to be this distinct holy nation, this kingdom of priests, and what they needed to do to properly worship God. That they were not permitted to worship God any way they saw fit, but they had to worship God in the way He prescribed. And then finally, there were moral laws. Moral laws were concerned with not only how Israel treated each other, but they were concerned how Israel treated God. So these are a mix of ceremonial as well as civil laws, that they are concerned with not only how you treat your fellow man, but they're concerned with how you honor and worship God. And these moral laws were there to keep Israel within the confines of this covenant relationship with God. And even Jesus Himself, Jesus later on in the New Testament, He says that these laws that were given to Moses for the Israelites, that they could be summarized into 2 simple sentences. That you can take all these 613 laws and you can summarize them in 2 sentences. That you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and that you should love your neighbor as yourself. That if you were able to fulfill these 2 things, you would be able to keep all of the law. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, this is a lot of laws for somebody to have to follow. It would be hard to keep track of 613 different commands of God that you are to abide by in order to maintain this covenant relationship with Him. And there's a few different reasons why there were so many different laws. The first reason is that Israel is supposed to be this holy nation, that they are to be separate and distinct from every other nation in the world around them, that they are to serve God and serve Him alone. And many of these laws are put into place so that they would be distinct from the other nations, that they would be separated from a lot of their pagan practices, and so that people would look at them and they would know who the one true God is. Another reason is that without these laws, Israel would not know how to properly worship God. That God wanted to dwell with man, God wanted to be in relationship with man, and it takes some of these laws that were given to Moses for man to understand how they can properly worship God and what it means for them to be in this relationship with Him. That if it wasn't for the law, Israel would not be able to properly worship God, and they would not know what offends Him and what pleases Him. Many of the laws, however, existed because of the hardness of the hearts of the Israelites. That they were called to love God and love each other, yet they failed to do so time and time again. Jesus even says in Matthew chapter 19 that many of the laws existed, that certain laws were in place, not because that's what God desired, but because of the hardness of their hearts. That they failed to love God and love each other because they had hard hearts. That the same issue that the Egyptians had and caused them to fall into judgment is the same problem plaguing the Israelites. That they had hard hearts, and it was causing them to break this covenant with God time and time again. That they had a taskmaster in Egypt set over them. That they were given an impossible task to do. They were told to keep up with a quota that it would be impossible for them to keep because they weren't given the required straw in order to keep up with their quota. And we see that they come out of Egypt and they're given a new taskmaster. The Bible calls the law of Moses a taskmaster. It's set over the Israelites, and it's giving them an impossible task. They're commanded that they must keep all these 613 laws in order to maintain this covenant with God. Yet because of the hardness of their hearts, they failed to love God and love each other time and time again because of their hard hearts and their own wicked, evil desires. And it seems like this is an impossible situation. It seems like all hope is lost, that Israel is given this impossible task that they must keep all these commands in order to maintain this relationship with God, yet their hard hearts keep them from doing so. However, eventually God, through the prophet Ezekiel, gives Israel a glimmer of hope. He tells them in Ezekiel 36, "I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you. I will take out the heart of stone out of your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you will keep my judgments and do them." Whereas Israel before was not able to keep the statutes and the judgments, they weren't able to keep this covenant with God because of their hard hearts. Here, God is promising that eventually He is going to give them a new heart. This hard heart would be removed, and they would be given a heart of flesh that is able to obey and keep the judgments of God. And not only that, He promises to give them a new spirit, and this new spirit is going to be His own. That the Spirit of God was going to be given to Israel, and it's through God's Spirit, through His power, that where the people were rebellious before, they would now be able to be obedient and follow the voice of the Lord and keep His statutes and judgments. They would now be able to keep this covenant that God was calling them to keep because they have a new heart and His Spirit dwelling within them. And we see the fulfillment of that in the New Testament. In the New Testament, once Christ sacrificed Himself on the cross for us, the book of Romans tells us this: "For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes." Here in Romans, Paul is telling us that through Christ, through what He did for us, through the atonement on the cross, that He put an end to the law of righteousness for our sakes. Where we could not fulfill the law, where we could not keep this covenant because of the hardness of our hearts, Christ fulfilled the righteous requirements of that covenant, that He lived righteously because we couldn't. And He then imputes His righteousness to us, to where we were wicked, we had evil desires, we had hard hearts and could not keep the commands of God. Christ kept the covenant for us because He knew through our hard hearts, we were powerless to do so. And it's through Him we are now made righteous. We who were outside of the will of God have now been perfected through Christ. Not only do we have salvation through Him, not only is our salvation now based on the righteous works of Christ and no longer based on our own righteous works, not only did Christ fulfill the law so that we would not have to, it also says that Christ gives us a new spirit. That He says He gives us a new helper, a new advocate, a comforter, that He gives us His Spirit, and the Spirit of God Himself dwells within us. And it's by the Spirit of God that we who were hard-hearted and could not keep the law of God, that now if we walk by the Spirit, we won't fulfill the lusts of the flesh. That where our hard hearts caused us to follow after our evil carnal desires, now through the power of the Spirit of God, we can live a life righteously and a life that's pleasing in the eyes of God through the power that's working within us. That it's not about our own ability, but it's about God working within us, fulfilling the words of Ezekiel, that God would give us a new heart and a new spirit. And it's through Christ that is perfectly fulfilled. That He changes our hearts and He gives us His Spirit, that through Him we can now keep the statutes and judgments of God where we couldn't before because of our hard hearts.